You won't believe the results. Resistance bands changed my workout forever. She stared at the dumbbells like they were old enemies. Heavy, cold, unforgiving. Her shoulders still ached from last week's session, that sharp reminder that something had to change. But what? She'd been lifting for years, chasing strength, chasing results, chasing some version of herself that always seemed just out of reach. The gym felt different that morning, quieter, maybe. Or maybe she was just tired of fighting her own body, tired of the cycle. Push harder, feel pain, take time off, lose progress, start again. It was supposed to get easier. Everyone said it would, but here she was, wondering if her body was finally telling her no. Part of her wanted to quit. Not fitness, not health, just this approach. This grinding, relentless pursuit that left her sore in all the wrong ways. She'd seen the influencers with their perfect form and heavier weights, and she'd tried to match them, but their bodies weren't hers. Their joints didn't protest like hers did. Their shoulders didn't click with every overhead press. Then she saw them, tucked in the corner of the gym, almost forgotten. Resistance bands. Bright, elastic, deceptively simple. She'd walked past them 100 times, dismissing them as beginner tools. Real strength came from iron, didn't it? That's what she'd always believed, but something made her stop that day. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet voice inside that whispered, what if there's another way? She picked one up. It felt almost weightless compared to the dumbbells. Too easy, she thought, but she wrapped it around her hands anyway, just to see, just to feel something different. The resistance surprised her, smooth, controlled, almost gentle. But when she pulled, her muscles engaged in a way that felt complete, like every fiber was working, not just pushing against gravity, but moving through space with purpose. What happened next she didn't expect. Her shoulder, that chronic problem child, felt stable, supported. The band created tension that built gradually, never shocking the joint, never forcing it into uncomfortable positions. For the first time in months, she felt strength without fear, movement without negotiation. She thought she was done with progress, that she'd reached some invisible ceiling where her body just couldn't keep up with her ambition. But this felt different. This felt like discovery. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin actually studied this phenomenon. They found that resistance bands create something called variable resistance. The tension increases as you stretch them, which means your muscles work hardest at their strongest point in the range of motion. With free weights, the hardest point is often where you're most vulnerable. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. She didn't know the science then. She just knew it felt right. Like her body was finally being asked questions it could answer. Instead of being given orders it couldn't follow. The next morning, she wasn't sore. Not in that deep, angry way that made her question every choice. Her muscles felt worked, engaged, alive, but her joints felt quiet. That absence of pain was louder than any achievement she'd celebrated before, because pain had become her baseline. She'd normalized it, accepted it as the price of wanting more. But what if wanting more didn't have to hurt? She started replacing exercises, one by one. Chest press with bands instead of dumbbells. Rows with bands instead of cables. Squats with bands wrapped around her thighs, creating resistance that made her glutes fire like never before. Each substitution felt like a small rebellion against everything she thought she knew about training. Her friends noticed. You're doing bands now, they'd ask, with that subtle tone that suggested she'd downgraded, regressed, given up on real training. She used to care about those comments, used to feel defensive, like she had to justify her choices. But the results were speaking louder than opinions. Her shoulders stopped clicking. Her lower back, which had protested every deadlift for years, felt stable and strong. And something else happened, something she didn't anticipate. Her mind quieted down during workouts. Without the weight of heavy iron, without the constant mental calculation of whether her form was perfect enough to avoid injury, she could just move, just breathe, just be present with her body instead of at war with it. Somewhere between the failures and the quiet mornings, she found rhythm and peace. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no before and after photo that would break the internet. But her clothes fit differently. Her posture changed. She walked into rooms with less tension in her shoulders, less guardedness in her spine. People started asking if she'd lost weight, but the scale hadn't budged much. What changed was how she carried herself. Like she finally trusted her body to support her. What surprised me most wasn't just how resistance bands improved my experience with strength training, but how everything started to feel different once I switched to the right method. I wasn't expecting such a clear change, and honestly, I tested it more than a few times before I figured out what really worked. This isn't a promotion, just sharing real results that made a noticeable difference for me. I'll leave the link below if you want to explore what I mean. She started traveling with them. Bands weighed almost nothing, fit in any bag, turned any space into a gym, hotel rooms, parks, even her living room during rainy days. The freedom was intoxicating. She wasn't chained to a facility or equipment anymore. Her fitness became portable, adaptable, infinite. But then came the plateau. About 3 months in, she noticed the gains slowing. The same bands that once challenged her now felt almost comfortable. Part of her panicked. Was this it? Had she traded long-term progress for short-term comfort? The old voice returned, whispering that she should have stuck with the real weights, that she'd gotten soft, that comfort was the enemy of growth. She almost listened, almost went back. But something stopped her. Maybe it was stubborn curiosity. Maybe it was not wanting to give up on something that had given her back her joy. So she researched. She learned about progressive resistance, about combining bands for greater tension, about using them in ways she hadn't considered. She discovered that bands could create resistance in planes of motion that gravity never could. Lateral movements, rotational exercises, patterns that mimicked real life instead of just up and down. Her body started responding again, but differently. Not just stronger, more functional, more capable, more resilient. A physical therapist friend explained it to her one day over coffee. Traditional weights are great for building maximum strength in specific movements, she said, but bands train your nervous system differently. They require constant stabilization, constant microadjustments. They make you strong in the spaces between the main movement. That's where real life happens. That's where real life happens. The phrase stuck with her, because wasn't that what she'd been missing? Strength that translated beyond the gym? The ability to move through her day without thinking about whether her body would cooperate? She laughed, realizing progress didn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looked like less weight, less complexity, less pain. Sometimes evolution meant simplifying, not adding more. Her training evolved into something she'd never experienced before, a practice instead of a punishment. She started experimenting with tempo, with holds, with combining bands in creative ways. She learned that 2 light bands could create more challenge than 1 heavy band, and that the instability they created forced her core to work harder than any plank ever had. What would you do in that moment? When everything you thought you knew gets quietly proven wrong, not through failure, but through something better. Would you hold on to the old way because it's familiar, or would you trust the evidence of your own experience? She chose trust, and it kept rewarding her. Her athletic performance in other areas improved. She played tennis without fear of re-injury. She picked up her niece without calculating whether her back could handle it. She woke up not wondering what hurt, but what she wanted to do with her energy that day. This is important to understand. This isn't medical advice. Everyone's body tells a different story, responds to different stimuli. What worked for her might not work exactly the same way for you. But the principle, listening to your body instead of forcing it to submit, that's universal. That's where sustainable change lives. By month 6, she'd completely redesigned her approach. Bands became her foundation, but she integrated other tools too. Some days she still used dumbbells, but strategically, mindfully, in ways that complemented rather than dominated. The bands taught her something crucial. Variety isn't the enemy of progress. Rigidity is. She started teaching friends, cautiously at first, showing them exercises that had transformed her experience. She wasn't a certified trainer, she made that clear, just someone who'd found something worth sharing. The response surprised her. So many people carried the same injuries, the same frustrations, the same quiet resignation that pain was just part of the deal. It doesn't have to be. That became her quiet mantra. Not shouted from rooftops, not sold as a solution to everyone's problems, just offered as evidence that another way exists. That strength and sustainability aren't opposites, that you can build a body that feels as good as it looks, maybe better. Months turned into a year, then 2. The bands weren't a phase or a temporary fix. They became her preferred method, her first choice, her foundation. She could still lift heavy when she wanted to, but she didn't need to anymore. The need to prove something had dissolved, replaced by simple enjoyment of movement. Sometimes, we only understand strength when it's tested, not by how much we can lift, but by how consistently we can show up. And she showed up, day after day, not perfectly. Some weeks were better than others, but the bands made it easier to be consistent because they made training accessible. No excuses about the gym being closed or not having equipment. No intimidation factor, just her, some elastic, and the choice to move. When she looked in the mirror again, it wasn't her reflection that had changed, was what she believed about herself. She saw someone who had listened instead of fought, someone who had adapted instead of surrendered, someone who had found strength not by overpowering her body, but by understanding it. The dumbbells still sit in the corner of the gym. She passes them sometimes, and there's no animosity anymore. They're just tools. They serve their purpose for some people, at some times. But they're not her enemies, and they're not her answer. They're just not her story anymore. Her story is about discovering that real transformation doesn't always come from doing more, pushing harder, or refusing to adapt. Sometimes it comes from trying something that seems too simple, too easy, too different from what everyone else says you should do. Sometimes it comes from one quiet decision to feel better instead of just look better. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is choose the path that doesn't hurt. Tell us what part of this story resonated most and where you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.